Welcome to another Modern Mind, Ancient Book, where we're going back to move forward. We're finding a love for the law, the prophets, and the writings. My name is Roger. I'll be your host for tonight. We have Ryan returning for the third part of our kind of question and answer series. What we're looking at is whether or not we, or anybody who believes in practicing, diving into, learning about, putting into practice Old Testament practices, is a Judaizer. Whether or not I am, for an example, a Judaizer. So, Ryan, welcome to the show again. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to have you on. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure being on the show.
Thank you so much. So today we're going to explore the question of why ignoring the Jewish roots of the gospel distorts its message. Would you agree that that's true? That if you would ignore the Jewish roots, that the gospel is distorted in its understanding?
I think it leads to a much lesser understanding of the gospel, because if you just think it's only about the good news, I think you're missing so much of the context and the larger picture that comes into play of what Jesus was actually saying and doing. And yeah, unfortunately, if you don't know the background and the history of Jesus's ministry and the culture and the people that he was witnessing to and ministering to and proclaiming who he was, then you're kind of missing out a lot of good things.
Yeah, I mean, for one, I don't think there's an Old and a New Testament. I think there's a series of covenants that God enacted and God alone on behalf of his own will and desire to bring about his own purposes on the earth, and, choosing the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons, which were later identified as the 12 tribes, was really not about flesh. It was about God preparing a people who would be beholden to a covenant that is, because of the fall, just we can't keep it. But it's that very same law that shows us how God's economy, God's ways, are just so different from ours, in that there is indeed a legal system that the spirit world has to abide by, and that the fall tied us up into that legal system, but the part of it that led us to death, which was disobedience. And so through our disobedience, God taught us repeatedly, especially through the giving of the tabernacle, that through Moses we needed a mediator, and that mediator would stand between God and men. And you can read all about it in Exodus. It's very clear that that's the case. And then following that God didn't need a man, because there's a point in Exodus where, Moses had been going, say, to the tent of meeting and meeting with God face to face. But then in chapter 40, when the tabernacle was actually constructed and instituted, Moses was no longer allowed to go into the presence of God, but instead it was Aaron, the high priest. And so he took, and this is the funny part about it, which I think people tend to miss, is that the Hebrews were not practicing right religion, and they were taken out of a Gentile nation, and then the first generation totally perished for disobedience because they didn't actually know God, they didn't trust him. And then it was the second generation that came in. So you have, the first ended up being the second, which is what Jesus taught us, that the first would be the last. And so all of the images there, you have the mediator, you have the high priest, you have the sacrifices for sin, you have, the burnt offering, like the body has to be destroyed and changed into this, smoke that goes up to the heavens. All these like kind of dark images are there, which then lead us to Jesus, who tells us that the whole of the law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, and that he gave us a new commandment, that we should love one another as he loved us, which means giving ourselves up. He told us that if we seek to save our lives here, that we would lose it. So he's basically telling us that all of this sacrificial system, where the innocent, so it wasn't the guilty that were given up as the kapara or the covering, it was the innocent that were destroyed, because this world is dark and it destroys what's good. I mean, does that seem like a good summary of why it's important to understand what exactly the law did for us to you?
Yeah, I think overall it sounds pretty good.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's a lot of nuances and things to explore, which, I've spent the past quite a while doing. If any listener would like to, every Friday night we are, going through the Bible 1 week at a time, and we're taking kind of large chunks, but I am sort of preaching and doing an expository thing on that, and you can get more of the detail of that. But the festivals and the practice of the festivals and understanding the law and seeing it as not like a stoplight, like you shall stop and you can go no further, or like a speed limit sign, like this is the speed limit and if you go past it you're going to get in trouble. So if you run a red light, the police are going to pull you over. If you go over the speed limit, the police are going to pull you over. Well, God is not that way. I think there is a limit. I mean, would you say that's fair, that there is a limit where God is going to punish evil? I mean, that's fair, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Absolutely.
But when you consider the timeline, so for instance, the very same people that were given the tabernacle in Exodus, in chapters 32 to 34, completely disregarded God. And Aaron, who was going to be the high priest and actually get to go before God in his glory, made a golden calf. And then immediately following that, the grace of God, I would say, still gave the people the temple and the presence of God and the system to atone for sin, despite what the people did, but for his own purposes, which led to the Jeremiah 31 covenant, the Brit Chadashah, or the New Testament is what we call it. But it was prophesied to Israel. Am I wrong?
Yeah, if you read the context of it, yeah, it was something that was being spoken to the children of Israel. Like Jeremiah was speaking to the Jewish people at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And so now the question is, are we trying to be Jewish people by practicing those things? I mean, does that kind of ring true to you? Do you want to be Jewish?
Well, God made me a Gentile, so I'm perfectly happy to remain a Gentile.
Yeah, and I say the same thing. Look, I don't want to be Jewish, but instead, I would define Israel as the moment that Jacob changed. I don't see, because that to me wasn't a flesh moment. That was a God moment. That was the God of heaven and earth in the form of a man, oddly, which we believe about Jesus, right? So, we call that in theological systems a Christophany, correct? Where,
Mhm.
Jesus pre-appeared kind of thing, right? And so, the God-man appeared, and Jacob not only begged and pleaded for his life because Esau was coming to murder him, but he grabbed onto, touched, clutched, and would not let go of the King of Glory. No other figure had ever done such a thing. And it shows the desperation that Jacob was in. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was not a good moment for Jacob. And it was at that moment that I believe, and this is how I see that moment. I don't see it as a, Roman Greco wrestling match, right? I see it as a moment of pure and sheer desperation on Jacob's behalf, claiming the promises that God had told him, but also knowing that if God doesn't intervene, he would die, and that he wouldn't be able to accomplish those, tasks, the things that God had put before him and promised him that he would achieve. And so, at the moment Jacob finally gave up all of his scheming, all of his deceiving, all of his self driven desires, when he finally collapsed on the God who could save him, that very God asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "I am the one who grasps at the heel and seeks my own way and my own power." That's what Jacob means. And then that's when God said, "No longer are you that. You're the one who wrestles with God." Meaning he gave up his flesh. He died to himself, just like Jesus commanded us to do. And so I would say that the idea of those who, like Abraham, believed God and it was counted as righteousness to them is the very same idea that's being found in this moment. That he became actually like our father, Abraham. And what I mean is, one, Abraham wasn't Jewish, right?
Right, yeah, he came before the designation of the tribes of Israel.
Yeah, before the nation was even created, right? And he was told that his descendants would go to Egypt. And so, there's a lot of prophecy, there's a lot of things there. But what I do know about Abraham is that he was humble before God, and he, even though he, obviously had some problems in his life, he was chosen by God. And that man, and when Jacob changed Israel, it was humility before God that made them justified by trusting him. And that the sacrificial system was put in place not because it saved us, because how can animals save people, right? But that it taught us about the one who was coming, the King of Glory, who would lay down his life being the ultimate hero and who could save us and become our high priest. That's why the traditions matter, and that's why the roots can lead us to proper understanding. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that sounds fair.
So that's why we're not Judaizers. It is really about the Torah. Moses was a wise and great man, and we should seek to understand him. Thanks for joining us, Ryan. We're on to the next question. We hope the listener has enjoyed this, and stay tuned.